Hi everyone, I've been experimenting with EEVEE recently for the last couple of days, and I was planning on this tutorial what tips and tricks I could share that I learned with my experiments in EEVEE regarding to lighting, settings, and compositing. So this scene here that I got from Open3D Lab and is a good example for a exterior scene where we can showcase a couple of tips about HDRI lighting in EEVEE and some compositing tricks and render settings. Here I want to sneak peek a little bit how we tackle the HDRI lighting. This scene is mostly lit by a HDRI. There is no sun lamp being used. These light collections here are for the pool lighting, so I will actually disable that so we can focus only on the HDRI. And a lot of the effects that you see here, like the mist and glare and lens dirt and bloom and everything, are done in the compositor, so I will disable that too. And let me re-enable the background so we can see the HDRI here. And this is how the scene is lit. I'm not using probes specifically for this scene. The probe is disabled, so it's a little faster, and I'm not using any bake lighting or anything, just basically ray tracing settings. So I'll show you how it looks without ray tracing. If I toggle the ray tracing options off, this is where we get in EEVEE. So no reflections, no bounce lighting, no anything. So this is one of the important settings to start with, is toggle the ray tracing options. I will show really quickly my ray tracing settings here. For the ray tracing settings, the fast GI and the noising, I will explain more in detail when you're talking about a more simplified scene. But for this scene, these are the settings that I'm using. Depending on your machine, you can reduce the resolution a little bit if you're noticing a little lagging. Another important tip is, usually I toggle the jitter options on. This is always on by default in your final render. That improves the quality of the shadows, especially soft shadows, but it also affects performance on the viewport. So in this case, since I'm using a HDRI with a very harsh lighting, that doesn't cause that much difference, so I toggle that off so we have a little bit of a faster viewport preview. I'm here moving around the scene, and sometimes it lags a little bit because I have other instances of Blender open and also screen recording, but for the most part it's very responsive. And the key trick about getting a HDRI to lit your scene in EEVEE from 4.2 and above, which is using EEVEE NEXT, first setting that's very important is under the World tab, the settings. You have the light probe and the sun, and under the sun you need to check the shadow options. If you toggle the shadow off, your HDRI will not cast any shadow. This is even the same for the viewport shading HDRI, the default HDRIs that Blender has. This is the settings without shadow option toggle on, and if you toggle even these HDRIs here, will have a better look and affect the shadows. So this is the second thing. So first, you need to have ray trace enabled. The second, you need to remember to toggle the shadow option on. I had the jitter option toggle here because in the final render, since the global jitter will be enabled, you get a better shadows here. This is our default settings anyway, so as long after you toggle shadows and jitter, the overblur will be at 10%, the filter at 1, and the resolution at 0.001, and this is default. This is also the default threshold and angle values. So after that, the other thing important is the actual HDRI setup. So if I preview the HDRI only by shift clicking the texture, you can see it already lights the scene. If I leave the camera view, it's already lit in the scene, casting shadows. But the controlling of that, you can control that in two ways. You need first set up the threshold under the Sun tab. If I decrease this to 1, for example, it does affect the shadow a little bit. If I increase that like a lot more, we kind of see the shadows getting a little bit lighter. And if I toggle the jitter option on and adjust things like, for example, the angle, which makes the sun softer, you can see the shadows getting a lot softer and softer the higher the value of the angle here. So this is one way to control it. If I toggle the jitter option on, we don't see that, but you can see you don't have a uniform, you have a very uniform change overall. So also the other way, which usually when you plug HDRI, you only have a single background texture, and you adjust the strength here. Like by default it's set to 1, and if I decrease to 0, you have no lighting from the HDRI, just from the emission, reflections and everything. And if I increase that, you're getting a lighting for HDRI. But what happens when you increase that too much, everything starts to become very, very soft. You kind of, even your shadows, you kind of start losing that contrast a little bit. Everything starting to get a little bit too overcast, right? And you don't have like that much distinction between like the shadows and the lit areas. So the first thing you have to do is, instead of using one background, use 2 background nodes, like I did here, and set them both to default here. And we're mixing them using a mix shader and using a factor of a east camera array input into the factor here from the light path node. So if you press Shift S to search, and I think Shift A to search, and then go to light path, the east camera array, you plug that in. That means that the top input will be the one that will affect the reflection and lighting of the scene, and the bottom input will be the one that's going to be visible for the camera, which is going to be actually rendered, so it will not affect lighting or anything. So if I change the color or the strength, or this will be visible for the camera and for the viewport effects and everything, but will not affect the reflection. So if I change here the color, this one will affect the lighting and reflection of the scene. If I increase the strength here, so you're getting a lot more control, because that way you can even use different HDRIs, one for lighting the scene and one for being the background. You can even use like a JPEG instead of HDRI, because render faster. But in this case, I'm gonna use the same HDRI, but using different settings for strength and setup for each one. So if I plug both of here, like plugging the HDRI to light the scene, you can see it's already lighting the scene and affecting reflections, but the background is still white. So if I plug that here, now you can see, since both have the same values, you can see like it's exactly the same as you just preview the HDRI. But now I can increase the strength of this one to have a little more blowout sky, like a value of 2, without affecting the lighting. All right. So this is the first thing that you have to keep in mind when you're setting up HDRIs. You can even, like, for example, if you don't like the direction of the HDRI that is lighting the scene, but you like how the clouds or the sky looks from this, you can just duplicate the node here, everything, and then change the rotation from the background separate from the lighting. So as you can see here. again, in our case, I want them to be synced, so I'm gonna use that just the same. For the other thing set up is how to actually control your strength of your lighting with your HDRI with a more like intuitive way, in a sense that you have more control of the contrast of your scene. So there was a trick that I learned a while ago, even an old EEVEE, or even for cycles, when you're trying to use non-high dynamic range image as a HDRI, and you have a lot of set of nodes where you can plug, but basically you kind of using the values of the image itself to drive the strength. So if I just plug directly here the image into the strength, you can see like the sun gets a lot more stronger, but the shadows retain the contrast, looking a lot more realistic, how you see probably in cycles, because the GI is a lot more realistic and or bleeds too much for all directions, because the occlusion actually works in a more realistic way. So this is one way, but how you control that, because it's directly input, then you use these nodes. I'm using a power node, which is a math node set to power. I plug into the wrong here, and by adjusting the exponent input here, you basically adjust not only the strength but the actual contrast. If I move this to 1, it's the exact same as I plug directly. If I reduce here, I kind of reduce the contrast overall. Let me set this to 1, so I have a very strong contrast. And after that, we can have a global adjustment by having a multiply add, which is basically another math node set to multiply add, when you can adjust the overall multiplication of this effect using the multiplier, and a additive effect if I want to lift everything, not only the highlights but also the shadows. So if I set this to 0, increase this to 2, you have a very, very, very high contrast lighting where the shadows are very dark. I can use this value here, which is gonna be very, very bright, so I can adjust that for like 0.1, and then I compensate that by adding values here like I did before, 0.5. You can see the lighting looks a lot more like realistic when you see an outside render. And then of course, if you think that's too strong, you can dial that back even more, adjust the contrast using the power without messing with this threshold here, because this thing also affects based on the strength of the HDRI. So it's kind of like if you switch HDRI, you need to adjust the strength, but you also need to adjust the threshold again. So we don't mess with this unless you want to have soft shadows, you mess with the angle. But overall, you just adjust the setup here. You adjust the contrast using the power node, you adjust the multiplication of the power using the multiply effect, and you add back values to the shadows using the additive component here, and then you adjust the background separately by using this light path as a factor of a mix shader, and you can adjust the strength of the background, or can even adjust like the color then separately. Like say if I add the RGB curves after the texture that go into the second background node, I can add a little bit more bluish and reduce like the reds, I don't know, so kind of get a little more cyan sky. You can add a contrast with the S curve under the color, so you can get a little bit more saturation into the blue sky, and then you can increase the strength, so you have a little bit of more bluish sky. And then since this is the one that we're going to be rendering, this is going to also be the one that will be affected by all the compositing effects. If I toggle the composite setup back again, you can see it's affected by the lens dirt and everything. and no matter what I change on the top one, let's say I set this both to 0, so no lighting whatsoever, we're still getting the effects from the compositor from the background sky. Okay, so this is basically a sneak peek of some of the tips. I will cover later how you set up the compositor thing and how you individually adjust the lights, but this is a tip that you can already use for anytime you lighting a exterior scene using EEVEE. Doesn't need to be like a very high like environment, it can be a very small environment, but just since it's an exterior, and you can use this setup. For interiors, you kind of use a different setup. You don't actually rely that much on HDRIs. Even if you have a background showing, you kind of use another setup. Sometimes we're probably going to like to use probes to bake the lighting, so we have better occlusion into interiors. But for exteriors, this is a good setup to have a very, very nice lighting, and then you can just swap the HDRI. If I swap that for other HDRI here, let's say this one, you get a different look already. Of course, this is a little bit more like, I can need to change the direction a little bit, so it's a little bit more sunset, like blue hour. Let me try another one, maybe this one. Yeah, this one, for example. You can see how nice it looks and how well it leads the scene, and the shadows, the shrink of the shadows and everything. And you can use this setup for your exterior scenes in EEVEE.